money.
Welcome back to the program. Well, it's been a volatile couple of months for markets and it's likely to remain that way for at least the foreseeable months, but it hasn't stopped the IPO market from powering ahead, at least in the first few weeks of the year. We've got our guest hosts, Jeremy Hook and John Noonan, in the studio with me, but let's get more with Dean Fergie now from Cyan Investment Partners. He joins us live out of Melbourne. Dean, always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's get your view first up, because I haven't spoken to you yet this year. I want to get your view first up on markets and how we're tracking, because the volatility certainly still exists, although not looking at markets today, you wouldn't suggest that. But what we've seen over the last sort of few weeks has been pretty amazing, given the huge sell-off we saw in Q4. What's your take on markets and going forward in the next few months?
Yeah, I guess it's always exacerbated at the smaller end. You always see more volatility than you do at the larger end. I guess what you've got to sort of remember is that the last quarter of 2018 was as bad a quarter as we've had for 10 years. There was a lot of wealth destroyed very quickly, and I think you've seen a little bit of a rebound at the start of the year. I mean, I guess that's probably been potentially a bit of a relief rally, and it's probably too early to tell whether it's going to continue throughout the rest of 2019, but it's certainly looking more promising than it was, say, 5 weeks ago.
I mean, are you seeing sort of opportunities at these levels? And I just sort of wanted to talk about the IPO market briefly before we get into some of the opportunities you're watching, because we had Split It payments, which I believe it's been described to me as a bit like an Afterpay, a bit like a Zip Money. I mean, how do you describe it? Because I mean, looking at it today, it's up 60%. Not a bad move for a small cap. But what's your take on Split It? And talk us through. Are you involved in this one? Did you buy into it? Would you buy into it?
Yeah, look, I mean, that float was sort of peddled around at the end of last year, and it was like a pretty dire market, and I think we probably wanted to support it because we had a lot of success with Afterpay. We certainly didn't think it was going to be as wildly successful as it has been in the last 2 days. Look, it's a really similar kind of product to Afterpay. It's at a much earlier stage of its business cycle, but it's also capped at probably now just a little over $100 million, and I think when you've seen Afterpay at sort of 3 or 4 billion, it does look relatively outstanding value. But I mean, the price of the IPO going from 20 cents, I think last I saw it was trading about 60 in 2 days, is phenomenal for performance.
Yeah, 61.5 cents. I mean, if it's anything like what the performance of Afterpay and how that's performed so far. I want to bring in Jeremy Hook, who's our guest host, because I want to get your view in general about sort of markets at the beginning of the year and whether you're seeing opportunity or value.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's been a nice beginning compared to the difficult Christmas lunches I think a few fundies had. But
it wasn't the most festive time of the year.
No, that's right. Yeah. So, but I mean, it was a bit of a liquidity event as well. And I think there's a bit of normality there now. It sets us really well up for, I think some probably quite divergent performance during reporting season. You saw that, we were just talking GUD, but I mean, that Split It also gave a nice business update. So operationally, there's momentum within that business clearly. So I think this is the case. I mean, we're going to see all manner of reports, I think, in the next few weeks that'll see stock prices go in various directions. So it's a great stock pickers environment and there's a lot of opportunity. So pretty enthusiastic about the ups and the downs for what it'll mean over the next few months, Ingrid.
It's tough though, because sentiment certainly isn't strong at the moment, John, and you look at that business conditions survey from NAB yesterday, and that sharp drop.
Big plunge. It was probably overstated in previous months, so that's what made it looked a bit too optimistic in previous months, so that probably explains part of it. But there is a lot of uncertainty, and I agree with Jeremy. If you look at some of the global headwinds, how they're going to play out, it's very difficult to tell right now. How's the U.S.-China trade dispute? Is that going to be resolved, which a lot of people are hoping and thinking it will, or will it drag on? And that's going to be a big factor. The global growth story is going to be very, very big for certain companies that really depend. How is China going to fare? Are they going to hold up and come through 2019? There's still quite a few China bears out there. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and I think it's difficult for investors. And really, I think when the markets get oversold like they did at the end of the year, obviously there's going to be buying opportunities, but you have to be very careful. And the only other thing I would say is that, strong balance sheets will survive through whatever storm comes through. But you have to be careful on the other side, on the deleveraging.
You got to be selective, Dean. I know you're pretty selective in your space, and you have to be in the small cap space, I guess. But looking at earnings season, we're talking about earnings in 2019, and you're talking about currency being a bit of a factor for earnings. Can you talk us through what you mean by this?
Yeah, look, I think what you see is when you see the currency trading sort of around 70 cents, it's probably about 10% lower than it was this time last year. I think maybe not immediately, but that can have a real effect on some of these companies, certainly the ones that do a lot of importing, a lot of the retailers that are trading on pretty fine margins. You know, you see that sort of change very quickly. They just can't pass that through the consumer. I think there'll end up being pressure on margins and also some of those numbers. Yeah, for sure. I think it's a potentially a real concern for 2019.
I mean, when we talk about sentiment, the retailers are a real tough space. I mean, do you see any value at all in the retailers right now? The consumer obviously has held up pretty well in 2018, but you've got to wonder about how the consumer will hold up this year.
Yeah, look, I think it's really hard to be very bullish on that sector, even though a number of the bellwether stocks, the JB Hi-Fis and the like, have pulled back pretty substantially. You've got currency headwinds. I think you've got a weak consumer market. And thirdly, I don't think you can really underestimate how much of an impact the sort of the wealth effect through a decline in housing prices flows through the whole economy and certainly the consumer market. I think they really pull back on their spending when they don't see the price of their property going up every sort of other month. So look, we don't have very much retail exposure at all, and I don't see that being a wrong decision at the moment.
And what about financial services? Because I know you're watching them, and obviously we've got a Royal Commission report due next week now. We've got a final date for that. I don't know how much this impacts the services, these services that you're talking about in comparison to the banks, but what are you watching in financial services at the moment, and do you expect an uptick for them this year?
Look, in some respects, yes, and others, no. I think what you've seen from the Royal Commission is a real kind of move away from the big players in the market. I think they've lost a lot of trust of the consumers. So these independents, the ones like Netwealth and Hub24, seem to be performing really well, and a lot of that's at the expenses of the incumbents, obviously the big banks. But you've seen IFF have some really bad issues. AMP, obviously. And then, the wealth managers are really struggling, one from the downturn in the market, but obviously how that impacts management fees and the like. Challenge is another one that's performed poorly. So it's becoming a pretty large graveyard, actually, that whole sector, other than some of the independents.
All right, well, unfortunately, on that note, we have to leave it there, Dean, on a negative note. But thank you so much for joining us on the program today.
Okay. Thanks, Ingrid.
Dean Fergie from Cyan. We're out of time, unfortunately. We've got markets closing in a few minutes' time. 3 points stronger, 58.77, perhaps able to end in the green. We'll bring you the final numbers next.